How we all doing, friends? We doing all right?
Good, good. I just remember it was like yesterday. I was sitting right where you were, Jacob.
Yeah, he's here now. Isn't that wild? Cadell Last, Matthew Stanley, so Dimitri, Cheaton. So no, so we're bringing all these people to Deer Haven Farm and then locking them inside. And then it works out really great. So it's a lot of fun. And I had a wonderful conversation with Matthew Stanley that we're going to put out tomorrow. And I really enjoyed the conversation with Todd. That was really, really interesting. And I was really interested as well by this question of like blink twice if you need help, Jacob. So that works out. This idea of can you like know the problems with the symbolic order, and doesn't that just get integrated into the symbolic order? Like once you know, the symbolic order, I need to be careful of that. Well, doesn't that just become a new kind of symbolic order? I really appreciated that question. I also really I've been very interested on like that question I asked him on, oh, what are some things that subjectivity gains by lacking that if it was complete, it wouldn't have? And I really like what he said about lack actually helping us not live with loss. Like because we have lack, there's a way to overcome loss because we can see it as a essential feature. But another thing that Jacob and I'll ask you, we were actually also talking about, and I'd be curious what you think about this. I've also been interested in antinatalism because that seems to be growing. And why is it moral or immoral to have children? That seems to be of great interest. And the other thing is that we were talking about last night are if all technologies have trade-offs, then what is the trade-off of like dialogos or these kind of net conversations? What can be sort of the trade-off that you lose when you have some of these conversations? And I'll let Jacob mention some of the things that came up for him. And then if anyone has anything, just say great, and then I'll pass it to Dimitri. So Jacob, Kishere, yeah.
It's so nice to be here. It's an absolutely wonderful, wonderful place here with your family, and honored to be on this side of the screen with you. So, yeah, in regards to the limitations or shortcomings of dialogos, what we were actually speaking to last night was that it's potentially a lack of shit talk and a lack of kind of back and forth roasting and this kind of discourse that occurs mostly in like male to male relationships and like banterous contexts in which you're basically just pegging each other down, and it's not really seeking towards depth in the same way. It's not seeking towards intimacy. It's not necessarily peaceful. It's more kind of combative. So that seems to be something that could be lost in the context of these more like liminal web game B meta modern relationships, right, in which it's much more about compassionate listening and deep presence and deep awareness and deep attentiveness and opening to what wants to emerge and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think about like trying to cut down a tree and my brother looking over and be like, oh, great job, Dan. See, someone's been skipping the gym. Oh, thanks, Greg. And how that actually has some sort of value. It's actually interesting because that has a function of a kind of valuable signaling where you're saying this is like a real relationship where we can be real with one another. So it's not fragile. And it's kind of funny because how do you online get signals of a kind of deep connection? Because it seems more difficult to do it, say, on a Zoom call or something. One of the things Michelle brought up that was very interesting is, there's that generality between face-to-face and shoulder-to-shoulder. When you're face-to-face, it seems more difficult not to take that sort of crap talking back and forth personally. But if you're trying to cut down a tree or you're trying to do a wrestling mat, then it's like together, like it's shoulder-to-shoulder. So you're giving each other a hard time to do that task better. And is there something lost in relation? And that would even, we just with the real and Lacan, there's something there that could be lost that then makes all the liminal web very fragile. And then basically, what if there's like basically a time bomb ticking that will blow the whole thing up because people don't have these more anti-fragile relations, and it's just a matter of time before something breaks through, and they haven't gone through that ventilation system that you might have on the wrestling team. So that was something that came up. And the other thing I'll note, and then I'll pass it to Dimitri to respond to any of that he likes to. And thank you for the compliment on the haircut. I desperately needed it so badly. And that would be an example of loss being a gain. Based on what we were saying with the Lacan talk, where you lose your hair and it's actually a good thing. But I'll pass it to Dimitri. And the last warning I'll give you is it sounds like there's a massive thunderstorm outside. So if we lose the internet, just jump back on, or if it's gone forever, I'll do it later tonight or something. I'm not sure. We will see. But Dimitri, it's good to see you today. I hope you're doing well.
Yes. So about this whole topic, it's I really liked McGowan's presentation, because today I was reading about is and the art problem. So McGowan talked about lack and loss, right? And then we related it to mourning and melancholia, where melancholia is that reenactment of loss that cannot actually go into mourning that loss, which is a mourning that actually discovers that loss, that there's not really such a loss, but that there's a lack, right? So you can also relate this to the problem in philosophy of the is and ought. And I'm actually reading right now on Kantian morality, and for Kant, there were basically three questions for philosophy. And one of them is like, what can I know? Well, for Hegel, of course, you already have to be in the business of knowledge or knowing to answer that question. And you can do that retroactively by looking at the movement of the notion. But for Kant, you could like kind of have this kind of outside view, this external neutral third, and posit these eternal categories of the understanding, right? Another question for Kant is, what ought I to do? Like, that's the question that philosophy should answer to us. Another one is, which was kind of like the synthesis of both, is like, what can I hope for? And for Hegel, he completely critiques that. Like, he doesn't go along with that at all. It's like, because when we are always thinking in this manner of what do I ought to do, it already into actual was the following: the unity as fact, talking about something that's not really relevant. The truth of the latter, however, is that it is internally fractured into its ought and its being, and this is the absolute judgment on all actuality. That this original partition, which is the omnipotence of the concept, is equally a turning back into the concept's unity, and the absolute connection of ought and being to each other is what makes the actual into effect. The fact's interconnection, this concrete identity, constitutes its soul. So Hegel's getting at something very deep here, I believe. And in German, the judgment is, of course, urteilen, which is like a primordial division. And this is like the fracturing, the internal fracturing of the concept into ought and is for Hegel the absolute judgment, or the absolute primordial division on actuality. So yeah, this is basically that we have to deal with if we want to talk about like what is reconciliation and how do we reconcile with actuality. For Hegel, this is I mean, I recently had a talk about this, and it's only love that can really do this. And love is obviously not something that has to do with an ought. Like we would never say you ought to love. Love is always about an is. It's very fragile. It sees the perfection in the imperfection, and so on. So I like, Daniel, about your question, or like maybe not question. I don't remember exactly what you said, but that's kind of what the idea I was struggling with with Tom McGowan, and that's the idea that you can never really get rid of loss. Like, yes, you can logically think out the fact that we're a lacking subject, but there's always a remnant of loss. And I think this is kind of like either like, then you go into the topic of das Ding or object A. So yeah, that's some of my thoughts.
Well, thank you, Dimitri, and hi, Root, and Javier. It's wonderful to see you, my friends. We may lose the internet connection because there's a massive thunderstorm outside. We will see. I'm going to pass it to Mr. Matthew Stanley and Andrew Luber, and we just had a wonderful conversation with Todd McGowan, who part of the Lacan seminar that's being taught by Cadell over at Philosophy Portal. And one of the things also we were talking about is how like people come together by like giving each other a hard time. Like men on the wrestling team will like harass one another, and that actually strengthens the relationship, and it almost has like a really important function, like sarcasm and harassment. And is there a danger, like what does that look like in online spaces if you don't have that on online spaces? Is there a kind of fragility there that's very problematic? Is there a function of that that's really important? That was something else that came up. And then I also mentioned the growing spread of antinatalism. That's interesting. But let me give it to Mr. Matthew Stanley, Mr. Stanley, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber.
Great to see everybody. I was also at the McGowan seminar. Thanks for putting that together, Cadell. McGowan's always great. I actually just watched his biography of Hegel. He put out like a 20-30 minute video, I think pretty recently. He was on YouTube, which was fun. But I wrote about this lack and loss concept, which I really like his way of framing it. I kind of framed it slightly differently when I wrote about it a couple months ago. I kind of frame it as, and one's not better than the other, but there's a way of thinking about, there's theories of desire, and some of them are pull theories and some of them are push theories. And so I kind of think about Lacan and like specifically Lacanian interpretation of psychoanalysis, but I think psychoanalysis in general as a push theory of desire, because it's about positing a lack that then pushes you towards objects in the world. Whereas I think that a lot of theories of desire are pull theories of desire, where qualities exist in the world, and then we see those qualities and we're pulled towards objects based on wanting to acquire qualities. So I was feeding my son tuna salad, and now he's just wants to play. So anyways, that's one way that I kind of frame it, because I use the example of St. Augustine and the pears, because he goes after the pears and he says explicitly there was nothing in the pears that made me desire them. It was only their status as prohibited. And so it was literally the function of the law to generate this void, this lack in him, that pushed him towards this contingent object. He says it could have been any object, but it happened to be these pears right here in this moment. And so I think Christianity actually has within it this theory of a push theory of desire, just like Lacan does. So, but I also wanted to comment on something Dimitri said about like love not being compatible with ought. And I think that there's something to do with the experience though of love that feels like an ought, because there is this function of like feeling out of control and being under almost like a pathological subservience to some sort of demand or drive when you are in the midst of love. So even though you experience love as coming from you, you also feel this compulsion that feels over, above, and beyond, and possibly even from outside of you. And so that experience has this experience of ought or law in it that I think is like, it's important to theorize that. It's important to theorize that. I don't know how to put it any different right now.
That's a wonderful comment, and I salute you for feeding your child tuna fish. That's really well done. I live on tuna fish, actually. Mr. Kishere can attest. He sees all the boxes of the tuna fish. He's like, that guy got an issue. I'll give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Jockin and I once did kind of a paper on the idea that lack is interesting because it kind of brings with it a sense of an ought. Like if you're lacking something, it ought not to, or you ought to address it. Or when you encounter someone who you fall in love with, you feel like I ought to be with them. So it is interesting that there are some is that bring an ought and other is that does not. And then the question would be, what are the conditions that make some isness have an oughtness in a lack? Because if it's like love, you're like, oh, I lack a permanent relationship with that person. You know, there's something you don't have. And it's interesting how in that kind of lack, there's a kind of ought in it, that there's some kind of horizon that's unveiled with it. And I always appreciate a good association with St. Augustine. So very nicely done. But let me give it Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, I hope you're doing well today. I hope you made it back home. Did you make it back home, Mr. Luber? From Deer Haven, did you make it?
I am in Los Angeles now. Finally, it was good to be back in Philadelphia, and it was great to see you. I can't wait to come back to Virginia. That's beautiful farm, great environment. So jealous of that, very jealous. One day, hopefully. But anyway, yeah, what Dimitri was saying was very interesting, because there is an ought problem. I like to think about that in relation to how Heidegger makes a distinction between how basically the Kantian notion of things appearing to me versus things just appearing. And that because back in ancient Greek, there was no sense of object. There was no sense of that. That was something developed much later in time. So the way people talk about like love, it's normally the object of love. So I think there was still a notion of love back in ancient Greek time, but the notion of love was grounded in how things appear versus how things appear to me. So it's interesting to think about the is and ought problem in relation to how the ancient Greeks would think, because where is that ought? Like if the Hegel notion of love isn't compatible with ought. Now, again, I haven't really read Hegel, so I'm not positive on this, but just based off what Dimitri said, and I trust what Dimitri said. So basically, where is the ought?
You shouldn't trust me, man. That's the first mistake.
Well, okay. I trust. It makes sense that what you're saying, though. It's making sense to me. But
Okay, for the sake of the argument, I accept it.
Yes, exactly. So my question is, in the paradigm of things appear versus things appear to me, where is that that ought dimension that isn't compatible with this Hegelian notion of love? Because there was still a notion of love back in the ancient Greek time, but that notion of love was basically covered over, if you will, by how things appear versus how things appear to just me. So that it's more of a question that I have, because, well, my initial answer to that question is that the ought is in terms of how things appear, and the ought is the same as the is. It's one of the same in the ancient Greek way of looking at things. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
I'm thinking it would manifest in the Donnie Darko costume. I don't know about you. Do we think the alt would look like Donnie Darko? I'll let you decide. Yes, no, anyone? Not so much. That's a really interesting question. I'll give it to Chetan here. There is something that when Beatrice appears to Dante, Dante doesn't go, how do I get to the object of Beatrice? Like the very appearance, and you could use a Heideggerian structure here, the very appearance of Beatrice brings with it a certain oughtness to it. And it's interesting because it's almost like the moment you ask the is ought divide, it's too late. Like right there, you've lost. Like you have to apprehend the oughtness in the appearance, like full throttle, or because the moment you think about it, it's gone. Like it's not like Dante said, should I love Beatrice? You just did. Likewise, there's something about the experience of beauty where you don't ask, is this beautiful? You just apprehend it and then ask if it's beautiful. So there's something very interesting there, Andrew. I really appreciate that question. And I'll give it to Chetan and then Mr. Fishman. And again, I warn you, if we randomly vanish, it's because of the doom storm outside. But let me give it to Chetan and Mr. Fishman. Mr. Chetan, it is good to see you, sir.
I've not sort of read my Kant in a long time. But I haven't thought through this question of what and is. But I remember my philosophy sort of professor a long time back actually, asked us in college that there is something about justice. That justice is not simply in what ought to be done. What has happened, what is in that sense, already includes within itself sense of justice. And if you start thinking about this, and I know Nietzsche is saying this, I think in Genealogy of Models also, Nietzsche sort of pointing it out to us that, that there is a justice in the isness of things. If something is, it's by definition at some level just. And I think justice throws open this sort of, which is why if you think about it, even the worst of natural calamities actually only become unjust when we bring them into the human sphere, when we bring them in the domain of language. Because it's only in the domain of language that is and ought can break from each other. In wider nature, they always coincide. For an animal, that is why it's never become a question of justice. There's something about language that allows us this split. This split between is and not. I think that's the first, sort of cut that we need. I think we need to think about that thing. Yeah, I think the second point is that once we accept this, we accept that language actually allows is to distance from itself. Becoming estranged from isness, that something like ought emerges. So justice in that sense, in any sense of the word, is not simply a question of what has happened is wrong and we need something else. It is a question of what had to happen didn't happen. What is couldn't be is. And thus we had to do it. In another way, that is how justice is always framed, that somewhere isness can't live to its own, identity or something of that nature. Isness splits from within itself. And what is at stake in that splitting, and how what contours does language sort of provide to it? I think these are some of the questions that I was thinking when stuff. Yeah.
Lovely, Chetan, and I'll pass it to Mr. Highroot. And Hunter and Trey, it's great to see you. It is very interesting that the word justice is almost like justness, like just like we're talking about the is-ought distinction. We were talking about how there's like Andrew was making the point of the difference between a world of object and a world of an appearance, where it's almost like when things appear or manifest, there's almost an oughtness in it. Like, so for example, when Dante sees Beatrice, he doesn't go, should I love Beatrice? He just does love Beatrice. There's kind of in the very manifestation of Beatrice, there's a kind of oughtness in it. But then there's also a kind of should I drink this cup of coffee? It's the fifth one of the day. Ought I do it or not? There's a different relation between that ought and the ought that's kind of brought forth with, say, falling in love with Beatrice. It's very interesting. I like this language question, and I do wonder, it is that we tend to associate beauty with something ineffable. There's a failure of language, like, oh, you can't say anything, which is interesting because it's like, oh, if you were to say anything, you would open the is-ought divide. You would split the signifier and the signified. So it's better not to, and just to kind of preserve that suspension in the all. And it's interesting how there's that association of it. Just like Jacob here felt when he saw me drink the 6th cup of coffee. He just couldn't say anything. He was speechless. Whatever he said would just do violence to the wonder of the scene. So as Jacob can attest to. But let me give it to Mr. Highroot Fishman. Mr. Highroot Fishman, I hope you're doing it. Yes, Chetan, please.
Quickly, I just want to say one more thing. If you think about it, this is very interesting. I remember in my syntax classes in linguistics, we had this notion that is actually in language always creates an asymmetry. Chetan is a man. There's an asymmetry between Chetan and man, subject and object, which always comes with the question of be, the question of being. Isness, which is where you can see this is becoming estranged from itself. There's always an asymmetry built into when we bring isness. Isness in nature is always equal in that sense. There's a sense of equality in between the subject. It's only in long language that it sort of splits in subjectivity, something like subject actually has to be thought through from that lens. I think something has to be worked out in that domain. Yeah.
That's a lovely point, Chetan. I like that. And I saw a mention of Mr. Hart's, David Bentley Hart's Beauty of the Infinite. I actually met him once at UVA. That was pretty wild, talking about the infinite. So it was pretty neat. But let me pass it to Mr. Zach Fishman. Not that he remembers meeting me. I ran into him as he was coming out of the kitchen and said, hey there, how you doing? So that was fun. But let me give it to Mr. Fishman and then Dimitri. Mr. Fishman.
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up on this idea of like love and lack and ought. And like, I think, Daniel, you said something really key here, which is that when you love somebody, there is the implication that you ought to be together with them, right? I think that love, you could say love is the desire for closeness, right? And there's something about love that reveals lack, right? It's like you don't lack being together with somebody until you fall in love with them, right? And there is a sense in which to love, like love is both a noun and a verb, right? You can be in love, you can also actively love somebody. And like to love your children is to take care of them, and to like there is a certain ought there, right? Like to love your children is to recognize that you ought to create the best situation possible for them, right? And so this kind of brings in this idea of justice too, that it's like if you love somebody, then it is imposed upon you to think about and to linguistically define how things should be and then move towards them, right? So I do think that love is an ought, you know what I mean? It's like yeah, if you love someone, then you ought to act a certain way to them. And I think that love, in some sense, it reveals purpose. I don't know. It was clear in my head, but
No, I think the comment, it is very interesting that it's almost like the moment you ask, ought I do it, it's too late. And it's interesting how love brings with it like an assent to it. And so almost the framing of the is ought, it is like with David Hume. Now, I will argue that I'm going to give it to Mr. Kishere and then Dimitri and Mr. Luber. It is interesting that I would argue that Hume's division between is and ought is actually to replace ought is with suchness. What he's arguing is that we have these general categories of what is a cat. Then we say what a cat ought to do, and we fit like random phenomenon into that category, and therefore it's an act of like totalitarian and oppression. What he wants to argue is that it's suchness you get ought from. So, for example, when you encounter the cat at the particular barn in its unique suchness, and you see that it only has, it doesn't like a particular food, then you would know you ought not to feed it that food because of its particularity. So there's something about suchness which has a radical singularity that Hume is arguing should be the source of ought, not vague general categories that can be kind of like oppressive on people. And it's interesting how love, for example, tends to be of a particular person, right? There's a particular person you love. You don't love humanity unless you're the guy in the Brothers Karamazov that Father Zosima thinks is sinning, because loving humanity keeps you from loving individuals in the Brothers Karamazov, so that's a big problem because you're loving a general category. But there's something about particularity that is a revelation of suchness that brings with it a disclosure of a kind of oughtness. So it is important to note, and then I'll give it to Mr. Kishere, that Mr. Hume is trying to deconstruct isness in the name of suchness as a ground of ought. And a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment people are doing that. But I appreciate the comment, Mr. Hyber. Mr. Kishere.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate the points you're making there, Zach. And what's coming up for me is this like ambiguous space between the is and the ought in relationship to love, insofar as we may have an ought, but the ought may also be an expression of a grasping or an expression of an attachment style, or a wish to bring something in. And there are also kinds of love which are more like a letting go, and there can be a loving is that is a suspension of the ought, and a sort of not knowing of the ought. So I'm wondering about that space and how we kind of discern the ought from the is of love, and probably that's a psychoanalytical problem as well. So
no, it's very interesting as well with, it's almost like when Mr. Hybrid is mentioning lack, there's a kind of lack in love, and I wonder if that almost becomes an openness to the other to wait for the ought to come forth, as opposed to when you are just like, oh, I love them, so I ought to take them to dinner, and then it turns out they didn't want to go to dinner that night, now they're upset, right? What you should have done is the ought, the disposition to the ought, which brings with it a lack, sort of led to an opening for the love to kind of come forth. So there's this interesting kind of, oh, I ought, hold back, ought, open, lack becomes open. And there's a movement there that's of interest, but let me give it to Mr. Dimitri and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Dimitri.
I've done some research into love, and it's funny, because in English, of course, there's one word for it. But then people want distinctions. So you're like, oh yes, but guys, way back in the Greek old days, we had eros, but also agape. So we had all these kinds of different, nicely tied distinctions, so we can theorize it better. And then you get Lacan, and he says it's just he says a lot of things about love, right? He says it's to whatever this phrase of like you give someone what you don't have and they don't even want, and also this desire to be one, he even includes that. But also there's somewhere and he says you cannot make sense of love. You literally cannot do it. It's impossible to say anything sensible about it, and you just fall into imbecility. So I think that's a good point as well. It's a very difficult topic. Now, as far as Christian love goes, or like a love that's actually rooted in some kind of religion, following Hegel, I think this has to go along with forgiveness, and this would mean that we're not just talking about love in a sense of just an infatuation with some kind of image. Zizek has this really great lecture about love and the political, and it kind of traumatized me because he made the point that I was trying was on my way to making in a way more like provocative manner. And he talks about Che Guevara, and Che Guevara said something beautifully romantic. He said, "The revolutionary is guided by a feeling of love, and without this feeling of love, you cannot be a proper revolutionary." Now, on the other hand, if you Che Guevara also has writings during his guerrilla war times in which he's writing about how he's chopping up all the enemies, how he's killing him, how much he's enjoying, fucking them up and all of this. And Zizek says something that I completely agree with. I think it's a wonderful point. He says, like, we shouldn't see these two things apart from each other. Like, this is exactly like the the partisan nature or like the partial nature of love, in which objectivity is just put to the side. So there's this side of love. In my view, it has more on the side of this infatuation, but this breaking up of the objectivity of love, or in other words, like what you experience, let's say, when you fall in love and you have your daily life, but you don't really care about all the banal activities anymore. You're just compulsive and obsessed with the idea of this beloved. I think in the end, love is yes, it's inclusive of that, and a lot of times that is what we are first thinking about when we think about love. But in the end, it like what I call the work of love is kind of it's so tremendously inclusive. It's really kind of mind-boggling, since in my reading it's analogous to how Hegel actually treats the concept. And when I was reading in the Science of Logic, I mentioned this in the net before. He says that love, or like, no, it actually doesn't say love. He says the concept, like love, embraces the other but doesn't do violence to it. So of course that's like the beautiful romantic side about it. But then, actually, in a few passages before this, in the chapter on judgment, he talks about how violent the concept is. So I just thought that was very funny. So that's it for me.
Lovely, Dimitri. I'll give it to Mr. Luber Hunter and then Mr. Javier Rivera, who's going to mention Pascal. And Thomas Jockin, it's good to see you today, sir. That was very kind with your review of Sam and Emilio and Belonging. Again, deeply appreciated. Thank you for that. You're a kind soul. We're talking about beauty, strike of beauty. It is very interesting, too, when I think of Beatrice, and I'm just keep using that example because I like Dante. When Dante encounters Beatrice, it is interesting how there is a kind of violence, right? Like Dante is like rocked out of his daily life and he's forced to then like reorganize everything he does relative to this experience of love. And then the question is, you could even say, like, if there was no lack in Dante, could Beatrice so strike him? Is lack the ontological condition that makes possible the openness to the other? That then you're willing to actually behold that beauty coming forth in love? There are questions like that, and the lightning is getting intense. So
yeah, I like the example of Beatrice a lot, and also with what Hyrule was saying, love is a noun and a verb. I also like that a lot because it really reminds me of basically just like this Heideggerian notion of being. Because if I just want to read this quick little, I'm reading these older seminars that he took in the late 60s and early 70s right now, and he says some pretty interesting stuff. But he says, immediately one runs into a difficulty. In fact, if the is, then it is a being. And if, on the other hand, it is not, then it's supposed to be, then it is supposed to be the bare empty copula of a judgment, ? So, to me, when you look at love in terms of just it being a noun and or verb, you're looking at it in Heidegger's mind within the vulgar sense of Dasein. And you're not looking at it in terms of if you look at love as a catastrophe, and not a catastrophe in the sense of devastation, but in terms of a turning, in terms of something being destroyed, then and what you get is love isn't the noun or verb. It is the copula. It is the connector of all possible nouns and verbs. It's that primordial place where presence is presencing, and it's once I think once you get away from that primordial place. I have to take this call. I'm getting an important call. Sorry about that.
Luber's important. He has like a call from the FBI. He's got to go do something. So, Mr. Luber, it's very kind, but please take your time, sir. I was going to say that Luber's listening, like all the Heideggerians are like, I heard the word is. I heard the word is. Oh, yeah. So we are ready. I am wondering now if it's possible to have a good life if nothing bad ever happens to you. Like if nothing bad ever happens to you, could you have a good life? Or is there something about the bad that is actually needed to wake you out of, say, enclosed dogmatic slumbers, various forms of auto-cannibalism, et cetera, so forth? But I'm just being provocative. Mr. Hunter Coates and then Javier Rivera. How are you doing, Mr. Coates?
Cool. Yeah, so I'll mention that real quick. I would agree that you do have to have some sort of badness in your life to be able to get out of the dogmatic slumber. I think one of a good term, if we're mentioning Heidegger, Heidegger has a quote where he says that our age is a flight from thinking. And maybe you want to tie Deleuze in here, you can say that we have to embrace the lines of flight, right? But the point would be that we're in this flight from thinking, we're in this flight of a dogmatic slumber. And, maybe we need a Hume character to arise us. But so more on the point of love. So of course, everyone knows the very famous verse, Matthew 22-37-39, love thy neighbor as thyself. But what Hegel says, and I think it's important here, is in the phenomenology, when he's responding to these various universal axioms that Kant would give and other philosophers would give, he says that it's important to be nuanced about what we're saying here, because loving the neighbor as thyself could be, sometimes it means establishing a gap between yourself and the neighbor, right? For instance, if the neighbor is like, oh, can you get me heroin, right? To love the neighbor, to be in their best interests, it's to not get them heroin. It's to establish a gap between you and the neighbor, right? Or between what the neighbor wants. Other times it is to love the neighbor as thyself in the common way, to give the neighbor what they want. And I would say that the second case would be like political, right? You want to love the neighbor as thyself, to be able to provide for the neighbor in a political sense. But with the first, I think that definitely when we engage in these universal axioms regarding love, I think Hegel's right that we fall into sort of a formalist picture where, because such situations in life are much more detailed and nuanced, we can kind of get away from that, and we just kind of, evoke these maxims which don't really have a tie to concrete reality. So, yeah.
I like that point. It makes me, I'll give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. I've been thinking, I've been reading Ivan Illich, and he goes to that verse and he points out that love thy neighbor avails. Who is your neighbor? Is the guy that you come upon on the side of the road. Like it's not it's interesting because what Mr. Illich is trying to stress is that it's not a systematic principle. There is a principle, but there is this kind of like, you have to have the action, the discernment. You see something and you go from there. And then you also have to have the live discernment of if they're asking you for heroin or decaf coffee. I mean, no friend would ever give someone decaf coffee. And so you have to have that live discernment. It's very interesting. Ivan Illich is fascinating. And then I'll give it to Mr. Rivera. Is because, he makes these arguments that, he's talking a lot about Christianity, and he says the corruption of the best thing is the worst thing. And so when there are these misunderstandings, say, of Christianity for him, because he did a lot in like orphanages and so on and so forth, then it can have these terrible results where then love your neighbor becomes love humanity. And if you follow Dostoevsky, that's a who decides what loving your neighbor, like loving humanity is, and it becomes disembodied and you lose the thinking. Please.
Yeah, one more point. I mean, if I want to tie Freud in here, he would completely go against this. In Civilization Discontents, he said that to love thy neighbor is like an immoral axiom, right? Because like what you're really harboring is these like internal feelings against the neighbor. And so maybe we tie him in there, it makes the situation much more nuanced, where loving the neighbor could be to repress these feelings against the neighbor, right? And to maybe install a gap between you and the neighbor as well. So it just makes the fiction more nuanced.
No, absolutely. And then again, Bertrand Saul, the playwright, he had this line where he said, don't do to your neighbor unto what you've done to yourself, because they may not like it. they may not actually like doing the things you like to do. So there has to be this active discernment. And I even would argue, just from an exegesis, that that's there in the text, but we lose that because we don't want to actively think when we come upon people and then respond to the particular situation. We just want to like do what we think is loving, and then we can sneak in some various pathologies into there and so on and so forth.
Lacan would probably say that there is no loving action that is purely loving, right? There's always I guess we'll use the term reflectivity of love,
Sure.
where you're doing something because it itself gives you jouissance in some sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
No, and then the last point, and I'll give it to Javier Rivera to tell us about Pascal or his cat, is that there's also, like we were saying at the beginning, there's something about the ability to give each other crap, because we were talking about like the particular trade-offs of dialogos, and sometimes in dialogos you don't have this ability to be real or to kind of like men on the, like I can think of the wrestling team, everyone tell me that I suck at the Peterson, and how there's a reality that kind of comes forth and a strengthening of bond in that sort of giving each other a hard time that actually is kind of needed, so that in the loving of the relationship, it's not concealing those pathologies that may be being projected like on the neighbor in different things. But that was another topic. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Javier Rivera, how are you doing? You doing okay?
Pretty good. So there's a couple of things that stand out to me. There's love as event, which is always the beginning and the end. So it means it cannot be simply a noun or a verb or combination of two. It has to be the predicate adjective, that which transfigures the subject afterwards, retroactively within the sentence. It's what configures the subject. We are changed by love as an event. We are, when we post hoc rationalize, we're already in love once we realize that we are saying I love you to each other. Okay. This is where the sense of ought, in my opinion, emerges. However, if we're taking the Christian paradigm, why does the ought fail? Why does love fulfill the law? For me, the ought is there solely for you to discover that it fails. You have to discover that your ought fails, which is when we start talking about grace, forgiveness, and so on. What for me is problematic that I still can't quite answer, because it seems like religion has been the only thing that has attempted to answer and sustain the failure of an ought. How do you sustain the failure of an ought? It's not that man can man can be moral without religion and God and everything. For me, that's a given. The problem that I have is sustaining that failure in ought, which ritual and so on seems to be the only thing that sustains the failure of that ought, regardless of whether we can actually live up to the moral actions that is supposedly being taught in religion. It's the reminder that the ought always fails, for me, that is probably the biggest problem in attempting to solve how does one do this without some type of religious theological stain in the mechanism. So the ought, I would describe it as and so then so what's happened is, yes, you're right, you do get a image because the event has to be interpreted. So what I'm trying to say is that even though the event sustains its sort of isness, that interpretation has to be constantly, that's the continuous ought, the failure of the ought getting back to the isness of the event, to which you can never really fully capture, in my opinion. So yeah, Thomas, I know you have a response. Go ahead.
Of course I do. Because the problem is with that framing is then the only thing that's shattered, the only thing you have access to is that shattered image. Like, that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's like,
but Thomas, are we not missing out on something? Let me push back against you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the distinction that that, for example, Hegel makes is that you have the sense, you can really have an apple in your hand, and then you can also have the image or the representation of an apple. Apple's actually not a good example, but you can also have a concept. And these are all distinct, so and I don't know about you, but I don't really have an image of a syllogism. I can think about symbols, that would represent a syllogism, But a syllogism as such is something you actually think through. It's a certain logical form. So in Lacanian psychoanalysis, there is a distinction between the symbolic order of the signifying chain and then the imaginary about, and that's like the images that you are talking about, the image of a loved one or something like this. So I think it's important, like, to still make the distinction, whatever way it is. Like, is it the way Hegel said it? Is it the way Lacan said it, or whatever? Like, there is a difference between like the logic of concepts and the sensibility, or like the image like nature of representations.
I'm going to meet you. Let me just summarize what I'm hearing. So what I heard was the argument is made that the concepts are somehow objects that have direct access to reality.
Well, that's not what I'm saying. That's
why I'm
besides the
asking for
point,
clarification,
actually.
because I'm
Yeah. No, that's no. Yeah, no, that's really kind of like besides the point. A concept is an object of thought, and insofar as it is an object of thought, it has something objective about it. And this is kind of why like Hegel and Lacan and kind of that whole tradition is obsessed with the logic of what is called the symbolic order, the signifying chain, or like the movement of the concept. So these traditions, they do rely on the idea that there is a difference between this pure image and the logical concepts. And so about the question of like, okay, are we really hitting upon like the direct nature of reality? Well, this is a long topic, but for Zizek, there's a reality to fiction and there's a fiction to reality, right? So like these lines are very much blurred. And according to him, we are never outside of ideology. So indeed, there is something, the way I like to think about it is that every shape of consciousness, every shape of spirit is self-deceptive. Every consciousness has a subconscious, an unconscious that subverts its conscious framework. So there's always something that slips away. And the moment you can get at the contradictory nature of what that exactly is and work through that, this symptomatic acting out that is based in trauma, then you can move beyond that shape. But then you will end up in the next self-deceptive state. Well, there's of course absolute knowing, which I don't think is a self-deceptive state. But yeah, again, this is a big topic, and I'll let others speak too.
Yeah. So I think that we're kind of getting into this weird, like, kind of almost Derridian realm with language. If there is nothing outside of the text that we can speak of, do we not just fall into asserting like a nominal distinction? We're like, oh, okay, so we're signifying things, right? Let's say this is a chair, right? But if I don't have a word for chair, then is that really a chair? What is it? It's just kind of this like this real that's out there that we can't really speak of. And I think that when we do this, we kind of fail to understand how truth corresponds to reality. I follow correspondence theory of truth, right? So a cognition, so an object of cognition has to correspond to an object, and that makes it true, right? And so I think that when we fall into this Derridian theory of language, we get away from the way that I would say that the folk, or like the non-philosophical people, all of us in general, I would say, actually engage with truth. We engage with truth in the way that when we think of something, right? If I think of a house and I say, well, I'm thinking of a red house, and I look at a house that appears red, right? I would say that this is a correspondence. I don't think that red house would not exist to me if I did not have an ability to think of the red house, or have the language to ability to think of it, right? So I think that's kind of the issue, is that we kind of fall into a Derridian trap, which I think is always self-defeating. So.
Yeah, I think I think what I'm pushing back on, or just kind of I'm challenging to the group to point out is, by the way, I want to point out that I'm not playing here like it's pure skepticism, like one-way train where we're basically trapped. I'm just pushing back on just what Javier was pointing out, the way he was framing it, that this could be that I didn't want to draw out how we're going to connect to reality. If basically, again, this, and by the way, like I'm actually, I mean, Dimitri, I have to say, like, the Stoics basically made point blank that syllogisms are figures. I mean, even the language of Aristotle talks about figure 1, 2 through 4. These are arrangements. Now, I don't disagree they're over a sequence of time, but that's no different than that's the discussion of any, from Plato on Timaeus about this point. We talked about the images of reality, basically moments of time being moments of eternity.
Moving to turn, yeah.
So I think even if we look at that account, the duration over time doesn't necessarily make something not an image. The kind of idea of and by the way, like the idea of images is basically standing for basically kind of static frames versus implication. That's also one of the distinctions being discussed here. Basically, and also symbolic logic. So the arguments of symbolic logic is saying that things don't stand for themselves as a static thing. There are implications to other things, which is why under that discussion, or broader definition, syllogisms are figures, and thus because you have the power of implication that draw you from a bunch of premises to a conclusion. But with that said, I mean, again, just to kind of draw back to what Javier was saying or talking about, kind of what I'm drawing through is that the events, right, that kind of shatters its self-image or images, right? That's kind of, thus you only have an image of that lack, right, of the kind of breaking of that image. And then there's kind of the restitution from that. That's kind of what I'm asking. And I think there is a way to break through this to kind of answer this question, especially if we think if God is not just, he's love, if he is actually love. So actually, that's why I'm bringing this up too, because if the Christian argument of God is love, when love is traditionally an indefinite state, Plato would say that, things like that. That's a very curious point that I'd like to get drawn out. That's why I'm bringing up these points. But I think at this juncture, the way I'm not challenging, but just curious for Javier to kind of flesh out more is this kind of how to break through the self-deception images or the interfacing. Like, what is the connection? And I understand correspondence is usually one answer to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just say that I think correspondence is just the most like a priori, an intuitive way that we think of truth. And that would be my main argument. I tend to be like an intuitionist when it comes to epistemology. So,
well, Hunter, just actually to draw on that point, I'm just very curious about this. Just love to flesh this point with you on it. No, normally correspondence requires a commonality, right? That needs, the symmetry needs to be of some common.
Well, yeah. So the truth maker would be that like being and thought have the same structure, and this would be like a Hegelian argument, you can say, where like the logic of the world outside of us is the same as like the psychological logic that we have in our heads, the universality, particularity, and singularity. That syllogism.
Yes. No, I understand that. Yeah. So what I'm going to draw out at this point, so I'm talking about Cratalis soon. I'm going to do a lecture series about it.
Sure.
Plato. And the curious thing is, like, so a drawing has a similarity by figure, right? Yeah. That's what, exactly under that argument. The figure of a drawing corresponds to the figure of an object, you know, whatever. But words are a really weird scenario because what's the commonness of it?
Yeah, no, language is difficult. I think that there has to be some sort of tie that language has to actual objects in the world. It's kind of hard to explain that truth maker, but I would just say that it's like an intuitionist thing again. I have a strong intuition that language has a tie to objects in the world, that language isn't just completely arbitrary, because we don't treat language like that. And we haven't treated language like that through all of history. So that I would just say that.
Just to sort of maybe bring something here, I'm not sure. I think this thinking about problem of linking language to reality is a very old one. I think it's the oldest philosophical problem to which we don't have a good answer. Even Derrida, I think, you know, when I remember when none of the philosophy teachers wanted to start teaching at Derrida, the first thing he said to us was, well, the bad reading of Derrida is that, you know, this question of difference, that the meaning of always gets decentered, it moves out of itself, and so on and so forth. Derrida's problem was not this meaning getting decentered. His problem was that if meaning always does get decentered, which is a factual thing, it always does. You know, meaning of something always sort of gets externalized to itself. Then how does meaning get formed itself? How do we know something means what it means? The problem is not simply decentering of meaning. The problem is the meaning still remains. You know, and same question, sort of Derrida's problem is with reality. That with language forming this, what he calls this movement of, center outside the, center in that sense, this externalization of, what he called difference in that sense. How does language go back and link with reality in that? And I think one of the two kinds of answers sort of emerge in this. One is this, what you get in Tractatus in Wittgenstein, that language itself has to mirror reality at some level. That is one kind of an answer, isn't it? That there is something about language that has to picture reality. It has to be able to have the same relations that reality has within itself. That's the kind of. The second type of answer sort of comes from Wittgenstein itself in his philosophical investigations, where he is answering that problem through this conception of language game, where he's saying that it's not simply a question that language is to picture reality. That is not a sufficient basis. That doesn't explain the problem. There is something about using language itself that no matter how much fiction you want to create into it, some relationship to reality emerges from it. There are two in that sense, and they're not two completely different things either. I don't think they're two completely different things. There is something of a movement from one to the other possible there, you know. But there is something about language always emerging from its own ability to collapse, its own ability to create fictions, imaginations, its own ability to, you know, play all sorts of games and emerge from it with some reality. How does it do that? And why does it do that? I don't think that's simply a question of intuition also. It's a very concrete problem in that sense. That no matter how much we try, it's not a simple question that, oh, language, you know, simply always escapes reality. It's the other side also. Language always escapes fiction also. It never finds its home in fiction. It never finds its own home in outside reality. No matter how much we try and break language from reality, it will find some link back to it. There's something really, you know, and it is at that level that we start thinking of maybe conceptions like an unconscious structure, like a language, or this problem of, you know, this problem of thinking language at the site of the gap itself, you know, at the site of the being itself. In that sense, that language becomes a conception at the point at which being articulates itself. In that sense, being itself, you know, presents itself never outside the domain of language in some senses. Maybe that may be one kind of thinking around it. May not be. I'm not sure. I'm not putting it out there in that manner. But I think that's a structure we are sort of trying to think. Maybe I have something to say on the love also, but maybe I'll come back and say it. Yeah. Thanks.
But Shaitan, what you're describing is the early Wittgenstein, and I just later Wittgenstein is just so much better, and he's critiquing himself. So I mean, it's like there's no reason to assume that mind, language, and world line up. Like there's no necessity there. There's obviously some sort of connection between them, but I think that as psychoanalysis shows that there's like we are these like dysfunctional assemblage. We are these dysfunctional assemblages that developed over time. And so like something is working, but also something like the gears are grinding too. And so like we don't have the ability to say that like, yes, that language references something outside of itself. I mean, Wittgenstein is trying to show in his later work that's like language doesn't even mean in the sense that it is like you impute meaning to it from an intuition, but language means in the same way that, you know, Zizek describes the turning of the prayer wheel. It literally works by winding up the engine and running, and so it produces the signs move, and and the expected outcome happens, and that's what language does. That's the tool. So it's the sequence of symbols that when you manipulate them, outcomes happen, and over time those habits become ingrained. Of course, we can always engage with the symbols differently and find a new possibility, a new rule that we could potentially follow. But yeah, so I don't think the correspondence like framing is helpful. Like I don't know where it gets us.
I think we can tie in psychoanalysis here as well. So language always goes outside of itself. For instance, when we say something, this is Zizek's point against Derrida on the reflexivity of language, right? When we say something like, I like Nike shoes, this doesn't just mean that I like Nike shoes. It also means something greater. Perhaps I want to look athletic for the other. I want to appear maybe stylish, right? I want the other to perceive me as stylish. My ego ideal is, you know, whatever. Use those terms. But so I think that, of course, language goes outside of itself in that sense. And I think the language has other connection to reality as well, in the simple state of like, this is a table, right? We're instituting something that this is actually a table. I'm referring to, yeah, ideal ego. I get those two mixed up. But we're referring to something that actually is a table. And I say in my head, I have a cognition of an object of a table, and I look out and there's a table. It corresponds, and I would say that this is the truth, that this is a table. I don't think it's deeper than that. I think truth theories get very complex. A lot of people like to make them complex. I think it's pretty basic, and just the way we've always treated truth for all of eternity, and the way we'll probably keep treating it. So.
I just, if you read Wittgenstein, what he's doing, he's paying closer attention to what's happening when we think than what you just described. And he's like, that's not what's happening when you actually think. Like, and so the bottom line is that when you think, you're not picturing table, like, and the picture of the table is also not what gives the word table the meaning. And you wouldn't teach somebody how to use table in that way either.
That's correct.
So anyways, I don't think that the correspondence of symbol to image to world is actually what's going on when we pay close attention to what's happening when we use language and when we think and when we learn. So that's like even though that maybe is an intuitive way that philosophers have come up with about like this is what truth means. Wittgenstein's whole point is if you pay attention as a philosopher should, that's just not what's happened. And he's not even making the claim of that's not happening metaphysically. He's saying that's not what's happening when you actually pay attention to the cognitive process and the manipulative function of using symbols.
So I think, yeah, we could tie Hegel in here. When Hegel discusses against Kant, when he talks about the categories, and one of the things that's really important is when he says, like, I just read this example in a paper, so I remember it really well, right? So let's say we're walking around or walking by a garden and we notice a flower, right? The first thing we see is the first thing we have to notice is the distinctiveness of the flower. The flower is not the garden around it. The flower is not the flower around it. It is a flower. So the first thing we notice is the distinctiveness of an object in the world. Second thing we'll notice is probably the shape, perhaps, right? Or the color, right? And these are, things that we realize afterwards. But the main thing that we realize is the distinctiveness of an object in the world. So it's that when I see this object, another thing I see is that the flower, I know it's a flower because I have an understanding that there are other flowers, and I know what a flower is, and I know what the difference between a flower and a tree is. If you want to use Aristotle's term of genus, you can say that in the genus of plants, I know the difference between a flower and a tree. So there's all these different categories which are involved in my perception of saying flower. But when I think there's a flower, right, I have to think an image of the flower, right, to be able to say, oh, there's the flower. And I just think that maybe I would say Wittgenstein's wrong here, which I do like Wittgenstein's late work when it comes to his hinge epistemology some. But I think that here he would be incorrect when we're thinking about how we actually engage in the world. This is exactly how we engage. We discover the distinctiveness of an object, we discover the image of this object. Then after a while, all these ideas of shape and color and stuff like that, the differentiation between the stem and the flower, right? All this comes in later. But what matters at first is getting this image of the distinctiveness of the object. So I would say that this is exactly how we create correspondence of truth to the world.
Maybe I can add something here quickly. I don't think it's necessary to sort of oppose this question of correspondence with Wittgenstein's problem of forms of life. There is a way, there's a bad reading of, I think there's a reading of Wittgenstein when you completely separate early Wittgenstein from later Wittgenstein. You say they're two completely different people writing different books in that sense. But there is a way to read these two junctures together. I think Lacan was one of those thinkers who actually, used the early Wittgenstein rather than later Wittgenstein to make that point, I think. That correspondence is not necessarily in opposition to this problem of insistence of language. Language, of course, always insists itself upon us. It is not something, this point of representation that Matthew is saying is absolutely right. That what we think in terms of representation is something we're thinking backwards. That is not how we are creating meaning. There's no denying that truth in that sense. But at the same time, while language always insists itself upon us, there is something like representation always emerges with it, alongside it. Language cannot function without this minimal of correspondence present into it, which is what I think Hunter is saying. So these two things need not necessarily be taught in opposition. I think good work can emerge by thinking them together about language. That's what I think maybe needs to be done in our times. I'm just opening it up here. Yeah, I think Cadell and others will want to talk to you. Yeah, thanks.
There's so much that I'm trying to think. It's a really fascinating conversation. What I'm trying to think with language is, and correspondence, is not so much that we have any conscious agency of the language. The language is more moving through us. Like the way you dream at night, the signifiers just move through you. They in some sense play you. And especially when you're in love. Like if you're in love, the signifiers are just playing you. I mean, I remember the first time I got broken up with, and I was not controlling my thoughts for like 6 months. Like I was devastated for 6 months, and I was actually gonna delay going to university for like my undergrad because I was worried that I wasn't gonna be able to pay attention in class. The language was controlling me completely. And the language was controlling me not in any correspondence to the world. It was in correspondence to the impossibility of the world. It was in correspondence to the way my language was my relationship to language was absolutely impotent. Absolute impotence. So to me, when we think about, if you're really going to think about truth, if you're really going to think about correspondence, it has to be in relationship to signifiers which are not yours, which you're the puppet of, and which are absolutely dangling you in front of different points of impossibility. And those points of impossibility to me have to be situated in intimate context, in the intimate context of your mother, in the intimate context of your father, in the intimate context of your partner, in the intimate context of your child. And if you're thinking about correspondence and truth and outside of that, you're not even, and sure, philosophy before psychoanalysis can be accused of that. In many sense, I think all of philosophy before psychoanalysis is guilty of that. Maybe not if you go back to maybe like if you actually could have strike up a conversation with Plato or something. Certainly psychoanalysis brings you to confronted with that. And like to me, and just to like sort of relate this, because I'm in a room full of brilliant people here, I have problems that I go to men's circles for. I have problems I go to whatever for, and I never get. There are certain problems that you confront an impossibility, which you can go anywhere for, and there's no one has an answer. No, because you're just left with this impossibility. So, for example, like I wanted to talk about, for example, the is-ought distinction in love. In regards to these signifiers just moving through us, and then just confronted with this correspondence to impossibilities. Like, I'm trying to say this in a way that's, I don't have to tell you the whole personal story, but that still communicates the level of the impossibility. Is you can confront situations where the people you love more than anyone in the world, or basically where you're caught between a rock and a hard place with two people that you love more than anyone else in the world. And there's no way out. You just have to, and even there's no reconciliation unto death, it seems. So I don't know if that's clear, but that's sort of like where my mind goes when it comes to language and correspondence. And I think if you situate judgments and if you situate syllogisms in that context, then they have a totally different meaning.
I'm gonna just jump in quickly. It's quite something. So it was fun. All the wind, this hail, and everything was really something. So we had a grand time. But let me pass it to whoever y'all are great. Y'all are all so great. So please.
I do think what Cadell pointed out is kind of funny. You're dealing with this storm while we're just sitting here talking about these concepts. There is something very very funny about that.
But there's so much
and-
hope in knowing that you're here talking about these concepts. You see, it all feeds, like, you know, it raises together. So it's beautiful.
You always have that optimistic twist at the end. I love it. But yeah, the signifier, like, kind of to piggyback off of what Cadell was saying, it kind of gets to what to me, it's a Heideggerian notion of it's always pointing beyond yourself, pointing beyond the noun and verb, so to speak, when referring back to what Hyrule said about love. But it's because there's this endless character of finitude. It's just completely endless, and it's because there's just an excess of presence, and because there's this excess of presence, I guess my question is, how does correspondence relate to us dealing with an excess, essentially? And what that would entail is that it doesn't correspond necessarily to the excess itself, but rather it corresponds to the character that reveals itself in the excess itself. So it's not that the excess reveals all of its infinity, but being positioned within, being present and being positioned within an excess causes this like finite, like trickle down effect where everything has a limit to it. And that's where language, to me, emerges. Language emerges at the boundary, the conditional boundary of that, the excess of presence. And like, that's why, you know, an idea kind of has you and you don't have an idea. I'm losing my train of thought, but basically the thinking, and I brought this up in a net conversation before, thinking for Heidegger is basically realizing that you're not thinking and provoking yourself into realizing that you have to basically embark on this journey in order to even start thinking. And that journey comes from a place of destruction where everything is destroyed. The building that you built is now collapsed, and you have to rebuild the building. And in that process of rebuilding the building, that's when thinking first begins. And that is because there's this endless character of being finite. And every time we try to develop like a set to understand the whole sphere, if you will, we always realize that there's always an other set, a different set that actually isn't captured by the set in which your worldview is being encapsulated by. So correspondence to me is the point in which your set doesn't encompass the worldview in which it was supposed to encompass. So corresponding is realizing that there's a different set out there that's operating, that's not the set that you're operating in, and trying to understand what you're trying to understand. So language, and then just to tie it up, my ramblings, but language emerges when the set that you're currently dwelling in realizes that it doesn't actually capture the whole worldview in which you're situated in. So when you realize that it doesn't capture the whole world that you're sitting in, neologisms develop and language and things happen. Like, for example, I could just imagine when you're these, thousands of years ago, before language was necessarily spoken or written like it is today, there was a set so to speak, that everybody was dwelling in. And then a phenomena, so to speak, was discovered that realized that the set that everyone's dwelling in isn't actually encapsulating the entire phenomena, because there was a new discovery. And at that point, that's when language emerges, because it needs to capture the whole worldview. So I think language is just this ongoing correspondence of the boundary condition of the set that you're in, and realizing that that condition isn't actually a valid one, because there's other things out there that actually encompass what you're trying to understand.
Yeah. I want to respond to Cadell real quick. I thought his story was really, really interesting. And what it reminded me of was I'm currently reading Leon Brenner's book on autism, and he discusses how I don't know if you would call what you had a psychotic break, but he says that a psychotic break is the feeling that language does not arrive in the symbolic, it arrives in the real. And the way that you're saying you felt language like take control of you, you lost all correspondence to it, that seems to be a type of, maybe psychotic break is too strong, you may not want to call it that, but it does seem the way you're describing it that you had maybe a mini psychotic break or some sort of on the continuum of what a psychotic break is, be somewhere on there, because you had this language take control of you. And I feel that heartbreak, which, you know, maybe some people could say is, depending on how serious it is, could be an opening to experiencing a type of psychotic break. But what I think is important is that when I talk about correspondence, I don't really speaking about it in the sense of like how language is in relation to the subject, but more so how like language is in relation to the world as a whole. And I think the subject plays a part in this, of course, as Hegel would, of course, want us to realize. But I don't think that what I'm speaking of is purely in the sense of a subject's relation to language. It's also language in relation to objects in the world. So that's more so what I'm talking about in terms of correspondence. You can maybe, if you want to frame it, you can say like the way Kant and Descartes thought of it, the way that they thought of correspondence theory. And Hegel, I would argue, corresponds as well. But yeah.
Avi, I think you had the floor first. So
Dude,
go.
man, Cadell killed me with that shit, man. He put on his sunglasses. He said, man, fuck God.
You put on the sunglasses just to say that, Cadell?
He actually put in the work for the joke. He didn't want to say it. He wanted
That's
to put
gonna
in
be
the
classic
work.
on the YouTube. That's gonna be fantastic.
All right. So I'm gonna try to say something. I like what Cadell said. So there's a couple of things that I want to make clear also, is that every time we talk about philosophical systems, philosophical notions, we have to hopefully remember that these are personal temperaments of our own, that it's the same combat we experience when we have love conflicts with each other. That your understanding of something is not my own. Right? That sometimes, and this is the other difficult part, is that we bring up these notions and it's like we sometimes, I mean, I do this, we sometimes talk about them as if we're not already so self-involved in what we're talking and preaching about when we talk about these philosophical concepts. And so for me, we have to always remember that these philosophical concepts are also the personal concepts that we try to abide by and understand the world by. So in some sense, it's no difference between arguing with a lover about your understanding of why you shouldn't take out the trash at this time versus this time, right? We're like trying to make sense to each other about things, and yet they continuously fail. Now, what Cadell reminded me of is that actually what's interesting about the good is that it's hard to imagine the good. Because all we can imagine with the good is its continued sustenance, right? It's sustaining. After that, once it's broken off, all we can imagine is its chaos, is its ending, is its breaking. And so I'm actually very fascinated with the fact that we can predict catastrophic events or upcoming catastrophic events, but we can't predict good events. We have no imagination of that. We can only guess possibly what it could be. But it seems like the good kind of rests on our own response to what is the predicted outcome of a upcoming bad event, right? It seems like whatever is good seems to be a response to something that is lacking, that is not there. So I really do find that really fascinating, that when it comes to breakups, it's hard for us to imagine falling in love with somebody else, really. Like, to me, this is the most difficult conceptualization that you can even come up with. Like, how can I imagine falling in love with somebody else, knowing full well I'm still very much in love with this person? And yet, what's ironic about love is that love always changes its face. So, phenomenologically speaking, I'm curious about, why do we tend to not follow the changing of faces with love versus the commitment to a kind of failure about remaining with a specific face? Because I think some of the problems with remaining with a specific face is that we're still holding on to that event of love as such. We're like holding on to like a trace as such. And I'll be honest, man, phenomenologically, this fucks me up every time. Like, you cannot discern what is the trace and what is the possible potential face, because you can't imagine. You can't even fathom what another future lover would look like for you, because you are so heartbroken, distraught, destroyed. And then there's even that skepticism of like, will I ever fall in love again? This is kind of just what happens with everyone. So yeah, I guess my main point is that it's so hard to imagine the good in almost anything in a futural sense, but predicting the bad, knowing the bad, what's going to happen if I miss this, that all seems like very logical things that we can sort of calculate, predict, and estimate from. But something that is good, I feel like that is really something hard to tackle and imagine.
Actually, so piggyback what Javier said and what Cadell said. You know what's funny? The image in my head, I was thinking, I heard both your commentaries, was the story of Job. I wonder, because let me give an example. So let me just bring this up. Do we think Job is supposed, right? If we take that account as he was the greatest man at the time, right? A prophet. Did he still have hope, even with his trials? Which, by the way, completely were meant to dumb. Everyone tried to explain away, justify, give explanations for, and in his righteous indignation, he's like, there is no account. No one could, I am not blameworthy. I've been humiliated. I've been shattered to everything. Everything that supposedly my life was meant to be around, well, objects, materials, honors, shattered away. And for no reason. I was the most righteous, the most generous. And he cursed his life. He definitely, but he never gave up God. So I'm just thinking through just the theological virtue of hope. Just thinking through that. Just like to just pause that for what Javier is saying in terms of the question of, we're so good at catastrophizing, right? Which is basically a fear of the evil coming to take us. But I'm curious at meditating on the inverse. But I just relate to what Cadell's saying of the story of Job. I think is the best example of that, where all accountings were useless, all explanations, all discussions, all escape was gone, nothing. And Job just had to sit there and basically suffer. That's it. And by the way, and we don't get an answer from that testimony. When God actually does come, he just says, you know nothing. You know nothing. You're never going to know. It's not your place to know. You have no idea about the logic of what actually works here. I meditate about that. So I'm just meditating to the group. It's definitely within himself. He absolutely abandons himself. He wish he was never born. He goes full Book of Ecclesiastes style. Better be never born. He goes that direction. He casts himself away completely. But God, he never forsakes. So I'm just curious about, I'm kind of bouncing back to the group that meditate about that, just because of the example again what Cadell was pointing out of heartbreak is a moment of like possession. You're literally just overwhelmed by your image in your head has been shattered, and worst of all, now you've been overtaken by it. You're basically a zombie in that way. And I just meant it actually is, you've been self-possessed now by these broken, shattered images. So you're almost undead in a way, intellectually. And it took 6 months or whatever time frame. And by the way, all of us here have suffered some heartbreak or loss of some kind. And it does seem to have that kind of quality to it. I would challenge, I don't think it was a schizophrenic, I don't think it was a psychotic break, because it wasn't like in any of these cases, we think that's actual reality. Like we don't confuse the datum of reality coming to us. We're not in some delusional schizophrenic state of psychosis where we're thinking of like, we're getting the images, the false images in our head are actually thought to be real with full confidence and certainty. So I don't necessarily think it's a full psychotic break. I don't think it's I don't think that's a reasonable framing of it.
That's fair.
I do, but
Yeah.
But it definitely is true that this is there's something about this possessionness about it that I think is interesting. All right, I'm done. I'm gonna pass it off.
I'm going to make a quick comment and pass it to Trey and Mr. Fishman. I'll say we have about 20 minutes left. I will tell you that definitely the weather forecast did not correspond with reality. So I'm now questioning the function of language because it wasn't supposed to rain or anything for a few days. The other thing is I greatly appreciate the fact that Mr. Kishere has not boarded a plane to run, because he's like, wow, I come to Virginia to be in my grave. This is great. But gentlemen, let me pass it to Trey. It's good to see you, Mr. Fishman, and we'll go for another 20 minutes.
Perfect. So I like what Javier said about how you can't predict your next lover. And I think that's probably has to do with like the essence of love itself, because I think that true love, in order to be true love, has to be an encounter with the other in its otherness, right? So you can't predict it, because then that would come from your own self, right? So it has to be like this encounter that's completely unexpected, and that has to do with the otherness of the lover. What Thomas was saying about Job, I also found that quite interesting. Just something to note, I'm not a Bible expert by any means, but something interesting is that Job and King Solomon, so to my knowledge, Job was actually a king of some sorts, or a ruler, and Solomon, obviously King Solomon, and they actually have parallel stories, but sort of in the opposite way, where you have Solomon, who is blessed by God, and then he obviously has this sort of fall, and he becomes corrupted, and he ends up losing half his kingdom. And you mentioned Ecclesiastes. In traditional Christianity, there's many people who will talk about how Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon as sort of his repentance. So that's just an idea in historical Christianity. And so Job is actually kind of the inverse of Solomon, because as opposed to being blessed by God, he is put through hell basically by God, and yet he remains faithful to God. And at the end of the books, Job actually has his possessions doubled. So they talk about like what he lost at the beginning, and then the book ends with his kingdom doubling. So we have Solomon, who was unfaithful and became corrupt when he was blessed by God, and his kingdom was cut in half. And then we have Job, who was suffering, and he was justified by God through the doubling of his kingdom. And for us as Christians, Job is obviously a type of Christ who suffered, right? He suffered, and he was pronounced guilty on the cross by man, but then God pronounced him not guilty. God has the true verdict, right? And he was justified through being raised from the dead, and given all of creation as his possession. So that's just some thoughts.
That's an interesting connection between Job and Solomon. I was not familiar with that. That's very, very interesting. I'd not heard that, Trey. Let me pass it to Mr. Fishman. And I think we're clear, so I shouldn't vanish in the next 18 minutes. We will see. But Mr. Fishman, please.
Yeah, so this has been a really interesting conversation about language, and I fear I'm a little bit out of my league here, as I haven't read a lot of the same people that you guys have. But the way that I think about language is like from just a pragmatic point of view, that language, like the meaning of a word, is like what I can say to somebody that will then bring forth the expected outcome, right? So it's like, a cup means if I say, hey, can you go to the kitchen and bring me a cup, you're going to bring me what I expect you to bring me, right? And so like, I think it's similar to what Hunter's saying about a correspondence, but it's important for me to recognize that like a table is also wood, right? And but yet, like if we're having a campfire outside and I say, hey, can you go bring me some more wood? And you come out with the kitchen table, it's not like it corresponds to the form of wood or whatever, but it's not right. You know what I mean? It's not what I meant. And so meaning has to do with action and with like the fulfillment of purpose rather than the correspondence to some kind of like Platonic form or whatever. And so I think like I found it really interesting what Cadell was saying about how heartbreak, like it destroys your language because you thought, you know, especially if you're not expecting the breakup. It's like, you know, I thought we had this great relationship and I thought she was the one, right? And like you have all of these linguistic notions of how things should work out, and then they don't work out that way and it just breaks apart. It's like, so what was that, right? And there's like this incessant search to then recapsulate the situation in a symbolic framework which is functional for you, right? And so it's like trying to relate it to what Trey was saying about Job. It's like Job has his whole symbolic framework destroyed, right? And yet he searches for an answer, right? And he doesn't accept a non-functional answer because his friends are coming and they're bringing him all these different frameworks of like, oh, well, this is why things are the way they are, right? This is functional. He says, no, that's not functional. That doesn't work. And he's left with this struggle, and he's left with hope though, because like he does engage in the struggle. He doesn't just give up and say, woe is me, and so I'm just gonna kill myself, right? I mean, I guess he does in a sense like question the value of life, but like you guys were saying, he stays true to God. Like he stays faithful in his relationship to the creator, and the creator shows up and doesn't give him a symbolic framework. I think this is so key what you guys are pointing out, that like the relationship with God doesn't mean that you have encapsulated reality within a symbolic framework that captures everything, right? It's the lack of that symbolic framework, and yet the confrontation with the absolute, right? And like Job is comforted in the end. It says like, I think it says he was comforted. It doesn't make sense still, right? He still doesn't have an answer, but he is comforted by the relationship with God, because God reveals himself to Job in his lack of a symbolic framework. And so, yeah, I think that we do have to strive to have functional language. And yet I think Cadell makes a good point that it is in the face of the impossibility of a truly functional language that we, like, that's where the wrestling with language really happens, right? We can't just, like, we do have to recognize that it's ultimately, it may not work, right? It may fall apart. We have to keep reconstituting it. So I don't know. I was hoping to wrap that up with a more conclusive point, but that's all I have to say right now.
I do like this idea of Job denying a symbolic framework. And it is interesting as well that there's kind of a hope that emerges, but is it in relation to the God that allowed all the bad things to happen? So it's kind of interesting that there is this kind of posture of openness, even in a situation where you would almost kind of say rationally, maybe you shouldn't be so open, right? Because, you know, this guy, you know, doesn't seem like it went so well. I'll also note I heard talk about, as I was making sure all the furniture was going to actually stay on the porch, but I did hear correspondence and coherence, and I see Cadell in sunglasses, and I wanted to notice, I'm now thinking of the movie They Live with the aliens behind it. He looks like the guy. I've got some bubble gum and guns. I'm all out of bubble gum because the appearance did not match the correspondence. They were actually aliens. So that's very appropriate costume, Cadell. I really appreciate that. And the other thing I'm interested, I'll just note and then pass it on. I'm very interested in this idea as well that Javier is kind of saying. It's like you can't imagine the fates of a lover. It's kind of interesting to me because it's kind of easy to imagine a bad thing happening. Like I can imagine, you know, a storm coming and cutting the Zoom call in the middle of everything and lightning and hail and et cetera, so forth. I can imagine these things. But if I imagine a lover, or like, and you would associate love, beauty, and goodness, right, with something like the higher infinites, right? It's really hard to imagine that, because if I were to say, I can imagine a painting, it's not really the same as beauty. I can imagine someone of the opposite sex or whatever, or someone who's romantically involved. That doesn't feel like it's the same as imagining the hurricane. Like the hurricane feels like, when you imagine the hurricane, it feels much more like what the thing is. Whereas when you try to imagine this kind of good, it doesn't seem as easy to imagine it. Like it's interesting, as I'm just talking aloud, like when you try to imagine a beautiful experience, that seems more difficult than imagining a bad experience. And that's curious to me, because then that would suggest the good resists the symbolic order, right? Like it's easy to put the symbolic order around the bad, a hurricane or a death or a car crash or whatever. But when you're trying to symbolize the beautiful, the good, or the true, it seems much more difficult to do. And that seems interesting, because there might be a change in the difference between the idea of kind of heartbreak. You have C.S. Lewis say things like, the road to hell is paved in frozen hearts, where the road to heaven is paved in broken hearts. There's something about the breaking of the heart that opens it up. But then there's the heartbreak that's a sort of devastating thing that discombobulates you. So it's interesting to think, is a difference between that kind of strike of beauty that suspends you, a strike out of the symbolic, whereas maybe devastation has some sort of strike within the symbolic that you thought would protect you from the real, but actually it does not. So there's something curious there, where then beautiful is precisely making pronounced to you the failure of correspondence, which is great. Whereas in the other way, the failure of correspondence means there's no safety. That's curious to me. I'm not sure. Chitan and then Javier Rivera.
Coming back to this discussion on love, and especially Cadell's point of, this idea of this horrifying dimension of language, it insists upon us. It creates, its own field upon us in some senses. It has this machinic dimension to it. Just on a side note, we've been talking about AI for a long time, and I've been trying to sort of, and people have been saying that artificial intelligence is actually very alien to us. I think if you think about it, artificial intelligence is actually alien to us in a very particular way. That its alienness actually exists within the domain of language itself. It's a form of intelligence that we use every day with language. Artificial intelligence actually is a form of intelligence, that always sort of accompanies linguistic or language in that sense. And we can think about, but language in that sense, this question of even the psychotic break, and if you think about this question very interestingly, this psychosis is a phenomenon, irrespective of whether it was or not. I'm not doctor, I don't know, I have no idea, and so on and so forth. But psychosis is a phenomenon, even if it is the very fact that it is possible shows something about language to us. The very fact that it just by naming it psychotic break doesn't mean it escapes a dimension of language. It may be bringing to the fore something very core about language also. There's something about, I think that's the first thing. About, I think, this question of love, the second thing is there's something extremely anti-political about love, which many people, from Hannah Arendt, people have always talked about, thinking about love in that sense, that love brings to the fore something about language at a point where it horrifies the very domain of speech itself, which is why love is not simply that kind of political act that you can do in the, there's something about hiding love from public sphere which has interesting dimensions to it, which we can think about. In what ways love becomes anti-political for so many thinkers in that sense. The other thing about love is actually very interesting. In Indian traditions, we have this something called bhakti tradition, where we have this idea that love can help you reach God directly. It's different from other modes of reaching God. Let's say intellect, let's say yoga, let's say love actually sort of somewhere, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree with the tradition in this meaning of the sense. I'm just saying that love actually claims to have some access to God, which is around language in that sense. How do we think about that problem? And one of the things about, I think, thinking about this problem, and I don't think I have an answer to that question, but one of the things about thinking about this problem is that love definitely inverts this, this relationship signifier shares with its own gap. In that sense, in most real engagements, signifier remains more important than its own gap. At the point of love, probably the gap becomes more important. So something of like that nature happens at the point of love. That gap becomes more important than the signifier, which is why I think Zizek, when he says that, you can never in that sense tell what is the reason for loving someone. If you can tell the reason, you don't love. I think and there's something what Zizek is saying has a quality of truth to it, which is that the gap becomes more important than the signifier itself, and the insistence of the signifier, this dimension of the signifier that takes its grasp over us. In most situations it does. When we know a word, that word actually pushes us to encapsulate not just how we think it means, but bring its own meaning into a signifying chain. It changes us, it controls us, it torments us, and all of that stuff happens, isn't it? But at the same time, at the point of love, that tormenting, that hounding of the signifying chain takes a different shape. It changes its texture. It doesn't mean the tormenting is gone now. It just means that tormenting now has to be accounted for from a different textual. It has a different texture. It has a different touch and feel to it. It's no longer this general tormenting, general hounding. It's something particular about that torment which then has to be worked through and accounted for in that sense. And how do we? Yeah,
that's really nice, Chetan, because now I'm thinking what Todd he was saying about the symbolic inverts, based on Big Sig's kind of comment, how in the symbolic it kind of inverts thing, but love's a different kind of inversion. That's kind of interesting to think through. And it is kind of, I like this point you're also making, where in the symbolic, the gap isn't playing so much of a role, kind of vanishes, you almost could say in a way, but in love, it's like constant. It's like pronounced. It's like there, and it kind of love demands a response to the gap. Whereas like symbolic almost is in the business of keeping you from responding to the gap in a way. That's a really interesting point. Let me give it to Javier Rivera. Javier Rivera.
Thank you. So yeah, this is what I mean by what I'm talking about. I can't avoid this theological stain here, which is the fact that even though language and everything, and love has its problems and that there's a gap, it seems like we're at a standstill with the responses to that gap, right? What is so significant about Job? It's not that just Job can't imagine the good, like I've been saying, but also that he somehow sustains his attention, which is something that only religion seems to always preach all the time, right? Keep your mind on God, whatever, etc., etc., etc. But to me, if we can just detract the kind of theological notions, what is the technique here? The technique here is attention. That attention to an object, the attention to an object allows you to hold and navigate the gap. This is what Job did, in my opinion. He continuously sustained his attention in spite of all odds, in spite of all the reasons that people were making sense for him. This is why I like Pascal, and I think Pascal's significant here, is because he says, look, reason can go both ways. Reason cannot have a decision in the matter, because it can easily be the reason to do this or the reason to not do this. Reason cannot really tell you which option should you do. So then what happens now? This is where I go back to my mode of waiting, where I would say I would redefine my mode of waiting as more like a sustaining of attention. Job is sustaining his attention through a kind of mode of waiting, not a physical waiting, but a kind of mode of waiting. Yes, Booberville. I got to tell Cadell, I met my Twitter twin. She's very platonic in general, so it's been interesting conversations. But yeah, so Iris Murdoch makes this distinction, which she's also been making me read, between looking and seeing. And I think this kind of answers Jockin's question. How do you know if it's a deception? Well, Iris Murdoch makes this distinction between that most of the time we're just looking. But the only way to overcome this deception is to maintain this attention into which you go into the mode of seeing. This is where morality and aesthetics blur, where the beauty is the good is the beauty, and so on, and you're a moral agent and all this stuff. So this object of attention seems to be at least one response to this whole dilemma. I don't know if it's the response, but it seems for Murdoch too, the object of attention is prayer, right? Which is something that most of us have a obscure notion of, at least in our just daily interactions with each other, because we think praying is just asking for what I want. God, please change the circumstances. It sucks out here, you know, right? Because I can only imagine the bad, or I must have done something bad. So yeah, I think that's just my brief comments on that.
I will comment on the awesomeness of the title of what Cadell put in the link. You know, where there's nothing, read I love you. That's really, really nice. And the bringing together of Buber and Simone Weil. I do like that as well. I'm quite interested as we come up on the end, but if anyone has final thoughts, please. We've managed to have a stretch here of like 30 minutes without the internet killing us all. Like I'm saying, Jacob Kishere is like, really? This is what happens in Virginia. It's very interesting, this notion of sustaining attention or sustaining where, you know, again, Todd McGowan, he was kind of saying, and it was based on Dimitri's question, where this, like the realization of the lack can itself become part of the symbolic order, where you're no longer actually living aware of lack. Like, it's the difference I've been saying between talking about Lacan and talking Lacan, where Lacan actually himself becomes part of a symbolic structure that doesn't actually change you, right? You just talk about Lacan and thus convince yourself you've actually taken him to heart when you have not. And ostrich politics will be amazing. I'm looking forward to the philosophy portal class to get into ostrich politics. Amazing. And it is interesting where we always have to like sustain lack or sustain attention. It's like there's a whole lot of emphasis, and then I'll pass it for final thoughts. There's a whole lot of emphasis on choice, choosing the right option. We don't really talk a lot about sustaining a state. And, you know, when you talk about waiting, and likewise, we talk about earning, like immediate, what are you doing tomorrow? What are you doing this weekend? But not like a long-term horizon of maintaining a posture so that what's ahead may disclose itself in a certain way. And it does seem, to close the point, it does seem like when we go through religions and there's emphasis on like ritual, prayer, fasting, all of these seem to be, can you sustain the religious posture? Can you restrain the prayer? Okay, yeah, anyone can do a 30-second prayer and ask for some money. Yeah, anyone can do that. But can you sustain a posture of prayer? Okay, anyone can skip a meal or two, and there's something good about that. But can you sustain missing a meal in a sort of fasting way, right? And okay, anyone can do a nice ritual at one time, but can you sustain doing the ritual every year for the rest of your life, right? And there's something about the sustaining, which then if like, there's always this interesting thing of like, don't judge, be careful to judge. But then at the same time, it seems inevitable to judge. There's some kind of judging that's necessary. You have to judge if you're going to do something or not. But then there's a dangerous form of judging that's kind of closing off. And it seems to be here, it's judgment of which inhibits the sustaining, as opposed to perhaps judgment in service of the sustaining. And then judgment as that would almost be a commitment. Like you say, I value this, thus I'm going to commit to it and hold to it. And it's very interesting if there is something about the human that is optimal when they learn arts of sustaining, when they learn to the ability to sustain something. And we might have a people that once, it's almost like you have to act from a place of a sustaining, from waiting, as opposed to act instead of waiting. And that seems to be, you know, if we're talking about beauty coming forth or being open to the other or keeping the other in their otherness and love, there's some sort of balance there where it seems to have something to do with that. So I like Cadell said in the chat, this Buber, Weil. I do think Simone Weil is a fascinating and important thinker in all this. But if anyone has final thoughts, please.
I liked your point at the beginning of the net, Daniel, about the danger of the liminal web with not having enough spaces of play and joking around.
Oh, I think this has been a wonderful example, not only on God playing a joke on us to see how we would respond with nature, but us joking amongst ourselves. So I think it was perfect. And actually, Kishere, we recorded something on that exact problem with dialogos or the liminal web, or like if you can't joke around, that's a sign of a deficiency in the relationship, right? And also joking has something to do, it's inevitable that some sort of problem arises, right? Like some monetary infrastructure, whatever. If you don't have a history of joking that you can remember, seems to somehow be useful in those times when you encounter the problem, because you can be, oh, I've had non-serious interactions with these people, but in serious environments. So I can kind of maintain to that and I can hold to that. And I do think there's something, I think a lot about wit. I think about how wit seems important in these places. I think about like Oscar Wilde, Chesterton. I think about that ability to kind of test the relationship to make it anti-fragile, as opposed to make sure it's not fragile behind the philosophy. And then the day the philosophy stops or something breaks through the philosophy, it will destroy the relationship. And so you got to make sure you have those tests. I think it's very important. Well, let me give it to Javier and Mr. Thomas Jockin. Thank you, Cadell. And again, I really like the They Live sunglasses. Oh my gosh, very nicely done. So Javier Rivera, please.
So there's something about sense of humor that is like, it can't be too much and it can't be too little. If it's too much, then you're joking all the time. You can't get people get mad, right? Like everything's a freaking joke to you, right? And then there's the people that are just too serious, right? They can never take a joke. It's always hurtful. It's always insulting. It's always, So there is something about how sense of humor, laughter, jokes, the correct middle place for it is that it has to be kind of lack. It has to be just enough. It can't be a complete deprivation. It can't be a full manifestation. It has to be just enough, which I find interesting. And that's almost how I feel about how attraction works too, is that for something to sustain a relation is that there has to be just enough. You have to be able to just sustain that lack without it overriding it completely or without it trying to cover its gaps in its fulfillment. So I do find that very fascinating. And just to kind of show an anecdote, this girl that I'm talking to, I mean, she's so anti-philosophy, it's hilarious. She's always like, every time I write anything, she looks at it and she goes, okay, but you didn't give me a definition. You gave me a description, right? And it's funny because I actually gave her a screenshot of the first section of our book that we all worked together, Thomas Jockin and Daniel. And where you go into what is metaphysics, and you're like, all right, well, is it this? And we'll give several understandings. And she goes, yeah, this doesn't help me. I have no definition. All I got was descriptions. And I replied, I said, okay, give me a definition of a cat without describing it to me. I was like, give me a definition of a cat without describing it to me, without me falling into some type of misconstruction about like, oh, well, small mammal can also be something other than cat, right? So you have to give me a better description here so I don't mistake cat as something else. But, unfortunately, because I cannot argue everything from my philosophical standpoint, you got to do the most normie thing and Google definition, screenshot it, and be like, look, definition, within definition, it says description is included. Anyways, it's just a funny anecdote to show that the fact that she challenges me on these notions, and the fact that sometimes I even have to respond in ways that I typically wouldn't respond, right? Like the way I would respond with Hyru would be like, all right, let's talk it out, we'll think it through. But instead, this time it's just kind of like, yeah, she's not going to take my whims, all right? I got to give some logical structure answer to things. But I did ironically allow her to accept that good can be indefinable. And she said, for some reason, that's the only word that she'll accept. But yeah, that's the end of my story.
And Javier likes to get beat on in his relationships. That's nice. Look at that. That's good. I like that. Let me pass. I'm really interested with the joking because I think that's really good. There's some sort of measuredness. Measuredness is seemingly part of the skill here that's very important, like the ability to measure and to read and to tell. And that's not always captured in the word choice, not always captured in the word judgment, even if classical thinkers would have understood that. Like there's a kind of ability to read a situation, measure a situation. And if you don't have that ability, I think everything's very fragile. There's a real danger there. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin.
kind of building that point of fragility. You know, it's interesting, like, because I love coming to the net. It's so fun because you guys. I was very pleasantly happy to see such a large room of people. It was really nice. Because I was on these notes, besides spaces that have ability to joke, right, things like that. I think also a very important thing in any kind of container like this is the capacity to withstand conflict. It was brought up. I just bring it up because, like I said, I mean, Javier is a good example. You having little tussles with your lover over there. We did a little variation of that where I was like, Javier, we got a situation. I gotta walk me through this. And it actually caused some, as I said in the chat, it caused a little bit of mayhem, basically, which timed out rather well with the chaos happening in your life, in your situation, Daniel and Michelle. So I just find that though that's a quality of a healthy container. It just causes way more interesting conversations. I think we generate from that a little tension, a little friction, a little energy, and thus actually initiating the hilarious Cadell moment of sunglasses and F. Kant came in. That was fantastic. Made my day. You know, and we have some people who are fans. They were in the group, so we're nothing. That's the point. So that's fun that we can maintain. And generally, that big problem when you have ideas as your identity and as the images that you adorn on yourself as your identity, when they get challenged, instantly it now becomes an identity. The problem is in the idea is not even interest. It's no longer the idea, it's your existence now being put to challenge. So I think it's a testament to this group that a container can exist that can have some levity, some humor, some contentions, and I think some very nice insights that came out of it. I think the discussion, I think we circled around, I think was some interesting points. We don't have an answer yet, obviously, but still, it's not about the destination, it's about the friends you make along the way. Okay, with that, I'm going to close.
Yeah. Can I just say quickly, 1 minute? Yeah. So I actually had a very close friend of mine long time back, and I used to tease her a lot. And I thought that's a measure of my friendship that I can, joke with her. Finally, one day I realized that at some point my jokes became bullying. I hadn't realized it. And she came up and she told me, you were bullying me for a long time. And I had no idea. I thought I'd bring it in genuine. And I realized something very interesting about jokes. Jokes can never be sort of treated with half intentions, in that sense, either you have the best of intentions, he's a close friend, he's joking with me, or you're the worst of them. I hate him, he's bullying me, there's something about jokes which is very polarizing in that domain. And whatever we do, I think and I think the test of a great friendship always becomes whether it can withstand that cut of the joke because of its polarizing nature. I think there's something about that which comes out in it. Yeah, and I have had a worse heartbreak than Cadell has. Just I'm putting it out there. That's a long story. Yeah.
I really like that comment, because basically it's kind of the idea that if liminal web spaces cannot bring in the polarizing, then they're probably fragile, and it's only a matter of time before the polarizing comes in and rips it apart, right? We've talked about the real of Lacan, different things. So there's something that's interesting about the joke, which is like a test of the polarization. Like it's an introduction of polarization, but not at an extreme level. You can start off, but isn't it funny that at some point it can change and be hurtful, and you have to have the measure and the ability to discern that. And so there's so many skills. It's almost like, I guess in it, you see so many like skills. Basically, there's like a bunch of skills there, like measure, discerning, like being able to be like quick thought, figuring out what joke would be funny to this person, because what's funny to one person won't be funny to another. So you have to know the person. The ability to tell, I guess what's interesting is the ability to joke or wit or whatever language we want to use doesn't require just one skill. It actually requires a network of skills in order to work. And it would seem that basically, if liminal web spaces does not have that network of skills, they're very fragile, and there's a giant risk there. And I don't think it's by chance. Like some of the people that I saw constantly using these skills were like unloading trucks, blue collar things, wrestling teams, like in these intense situations. That's where those skills were really exercised quite a lot. I'm not saying every blue collar work or wrestling team or whatever did that, but it was interesting where the seriousness, intensity of the situation or task brought with it some of these kind of ways of talking to one another, as if the skills that were learned in these ways of talking were needed for those tasks. And so basically the point would be, if it's inevitable that more serious tasks or problem arrive at the liminal web, if you will, if those skills are not there, it might not be able to respond to them in a good way. Or a lot of people are saying, oh, we need to make new communities. We need to make new commons. Well, if those skills are not there, it will probably be a big problem. And definitely Cadell Theory Underground is wonderful. I really enjoy them very much. And I like Dave's presentation on the scene. I thought that was really nice. And I thought that was beautiful. And to close, I will say, I think this conversation did though prove that words correspond. Because before we started, I mentioned stressors and jokes and all those different things, and proceeded to have the storm knock out the net, where God heard it as a prayer. And he's like, you're saying I don't answer prayers? I'll answer a prayer. Yeah, here you go. And proceeded to make the episode of the net undergo corresponding with some of the topics that were brought up. So it was lovely to have the medium match the message. I am very grateful for the opportunity that we could go forth. And thank you so much for your time. For the afternoon in the summer of Virginia is a mixed bag of possibilities. So my children are like, it's also fun. You actually, as a closing point, what is interesting is we're talking about stressors and how adults can respond to like stressors in problematic ways. Children see the storm and they're like, this is amazing. They're outside like dancing in the rain and the hail. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And maybe that speaks a little bit to that Nietzschean child, where not only is the child able to create values, they're able to see value in the storm. So maybe that's something that we need to implement in ourselves. And maybe there's a certain value that it can occur in the storm that is of a particular character of beauty that can be known in no other context. So let us hope to see beauty in storms. Thank you all. This has been a pleasure. I've enjoyed it very much. Have a good one, everyone. You're beautiful. You're all beautiful.